January 1944. A heavy mist rolls across the jungle airstrip of Rabaul. The once proud stronghold of the Japanese Empire lies shrouded in silence. Fuel drums rust in the mud. The aircraft that once roared toward glory now sit broken and skeletal under the weight of tropical rain. Inside a low bunker carved into the hillside, Colonel Genzo Watanabe listens to a cracked radio. Static. No new orders. The Empire had promised relief. Ships, planes, reinforcements, but months have passed. His men ration rice by the grain now. He looks at the map on the wall. Its red circles, once symbols of dominance. Now they are cages. Isolated islands cut off one by one. The Americans have not attacked Rabaul. They did something far worse. They went around it. The colonel doesn't yet understand the full strategy unfolding across the Pacific. But he can feel it, in the silence and the hunger in the stillness of a fortress no longer part of the war. The tide of empire is receding, not in fire, but in starvation. And far across the ocean, American generals are already planning the next leap forward. By early 1942, Japan stood as the dominant power of the Pacific. In less than 6 months after Pearl Harbor, its armies had swept across half the oceanic world. The rising sun flew over Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. From the jungles of Burma to the shores of New Guinea, the Empire of Japan had carved an empire larger than the Third Reich. Tokyo's high command called it the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. But behind the phrase lay the same reality that fueled every empire: conquest, resources, and control. Oil from the Indies, rubber from Malaya, tin and nickel from the Philippines. Each captured territory fed the Japanese war machine, and for a brief moment it seemed unstoppable. In Tokyo, generals and admirals spoke confidently of a defensive perimeter stretching thousands of miles, a fortress line that would bleed any American counterattack before it reached Japan. The plan was simple: seize enough territory to make any invasion too costly, and force the United States to accept a negotiated peace. But the Japanese underestimated two things: American industry and American patience. In June 1942, that overconfidence met its first shock. At Midway, 4 of Japan's frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, went to the bottom of the sea within a single day. The battle was short but decisive. The Japanese Navy, which had dominated the Pacific for months, now faced a rebuilding process it could not match. Still, Japan held most of its territorial gains. The Imperial General Headquarters believed the Americans would strike head-on, island by island, in costly assaults. They prepared for it, building fortifications across the Pacific, on islands most Americans had never heard of: Tarawa, Kwajalein, Rabaul, Truk, Saipan. Concrete bunkers, airstrips hidden under palm trees, networks of tunnels carved into volcanic rock. Japan poured its best engineers and manpower into turning these islands into fortresses. Each one was to be defended to the last man. To Tokyo, this was sound logic. They believed geography was their ally. Every island another wall against invasion. If the U.S. tried to cross the Pacific the way Japan expected, it would bleed itself to death before reaching the home islands. But the Americans saw something else. They saw the Pacific not as a line of fortresses to storm, but as a vast ocean of opportunity. A chessboard where not every piece needed to be taken to win the game. As 1943 began, 2 men took center stage in planning the American counteroffensive. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, calm, analytical, commanding the Pacific Ocean areas, and General Douglas MacArthur, fiery, dramatic, vowing to return to the Philippines after his retreat from Corregidor. The 2 men often disagreed, not about victory but about how to reach it. MacArthur preferred advancing along New Guinea and the southern route toward the Philippines. Nimitz wanted to push through the Central Pacific, through the Gilberts and Marshalls, straight toward Japan. In Washington, the Joint Chiefs approved both paths. The Pacific War would now move on 2 converging axes, north and south, each cutting through Japan's empire like a knife through cloth. But even then, the idea of bypassing major strongholds seemed radical. In the minds of Japanese officers, leaving enemy garrisons untouched was absurd, cowardly even. To them, honor and warfare were direct confrontations. A soldier's duty was to fight, not evade. The Americans thought differently. They were learning a new kind of warfare, one where logistics, air power, and mobility mattered more than sheer numbers. By mid-1943, the first signs of Japan's strategic vulnerability began to show. Its supply lines, stretched thin across thousands of miles, were breaking. Submarines preyed on transports. Fuel convoys were ambushed. Aircraft production lagged behind losses. And in secret, inside briefing rooms in Pearl Harbor and Brisbane, a revolutionary concept was taking shape, one that would change the war's course and leave entire Japanese garrisons stranded in silence. A strategy of skipping heavily defended islands, seizing only those necessary for airfields and naval bases, and letting the others wither on the vine. It would come to be known as island hopping. But in 1943, the Japanese high command could not yet imagine it. They still laughed at the notion that any enemy would dare to go around their bastions. They didn't realize that in a war of islands, the deadliest weapon was not the assault, it was neglect. By late 1943, the war in the Pacific was entering a new phase. The United States, once on the defensive, now commanded the initiative. From the factories of Detroit to the shipyards of San Francisco, America was producing at a pace the world had never seen. New carriers slid down their ways each month. Destroyers left dry docks weekly, and aircraft poured from assembly lines faster than Japan could shoot them down. The balance had shifted, yet the Pacific was vast and every mile gained came at immense cost. Guadalcanal had proven that even a single island could drain fleets' fuel and lives. If every Japanese outpost was to be taken head-on, the war would last a decade. It was in this moment of calculation and exhaustion that American strategists began to ask a simple question. What if some battles didn't have to be fought at all? The idea was first tested in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea campaigns. General MacArthur, operating from Australia, faced a chain of heavily fortified Japanese bases along the northern coast of New Guinea. The traditional approach would have required taking each stronghold, Lae, Salamaua, Wewak, Hollandia, one by one. Instead, MacArthur proposed something revolutionary. Bypass the strongest positions, seize lightly defended airfields nearby, and use air power to isolate and neutralize the bypassed enemy. When MacArthur's forces leapfrogged around Salamaua in mid-1943, the result was immediate. Japanese garrisons, cut off from supplies, began to wither without a single major battle. Their airfields became useless, their troops stranded. The success caught the attention of Admiral Nimitz. He saw the same logic could apply across the Central Pacific, but on a far grander scale. In November 1943, Nimitz launched Operation Galvanic, targeting the Gilbert Islands, specifically Tarawa and Makin. It was the first major test of America's new amphibious warfare doctrine. The cost at Tarawa was horrific. In just 76 hours, over 1,000 U.S. Marines were killed and nearly 2,000 wounded. But the lesson was clear. With proper planning, coordination, and naval firepower, the United States could take fortified islands, and then move past the rest. By early 1944, Nimitz's forces pushed toward the Marshall Islands, skipping over heavily defended atolls like Woche and Malulap, and striking instead at weaker but strategically vital positions such as Kwajalein and Majuro. The result was astonishing. In less than 3 months, Japan's supposedly impenetrable defensive perimeter in the Central Pacific had been breached. Many Japanese officers were stunned. Their plans had assumed the Americans would grind through every island, bleeding themselves on coral reefs and machine gun nests. Instead, U.S. forces advanced hundreds of miles at a time, ignoring entire garrisons and leaving them behind to starve. Tokyo radio still boasted of Japan's invincible fortresses, but on the ground, commanders in those fortresses were already isolated. Their supply ships sunk, their radio signals fading into static. Behind the tactical success lay a deeper revolution in warfare. Island hopping was not simply a matter of choosing which island to attack. It was the application of air power, logistics, and intelligence on a scale never before attempted. Each captured island became a new forward base, a floating airfield in the middle of the ocean. From these bases, American bombers could reach deeper into Japan's perimeter, cutting supply routes and softening the next target. The strategy also revealed a striking contrast in philosophy. Japan built its empire on defense, a network of fixed fortifications and garrisons waiting for the enemy to come. America built its counteroffensive on mobility, striking only where necessary and moving faster than Japan could react. This was not a war of attrition anymore. It was a war of bypassing, isolating, and suffocating. By 1944, thousands of Japanese soldiers across the Pacific were effectively ghosts, still armed, still ready, but forgotten by their empire. On islands like Nauru, Wake, and Rabaul, their commanders sent messages to Tokyo that would never be answered. The laughter in the war rooms of Tokyo had faded into disbelief. Japanese generals could not understand how an army could win by not attacking. To them, it defied the logic of Bushido, the code that glorified direct confrontation and sacrifice. But to the Americans, this was not about honor. It was about ending the war efficiently, taking the shortest path to Japan while leaving the rest of the empire to collapse under its own weight. As 1944 dawned, that collapse had already begun. The fortress islands once hailed as unsinkable battleships were becoming prisons. Their defenders would wait for battles that never came. And as the Americans moved steadily westward, toward the Marianas, toward the Philippines, and eventually toward Japan itself, the silent suffering on those forgotten islands grew with each passing tide. When the first waves of island hopping left certain Japanese garrisons untouched, no one truly understood what it meant. At first, the bypassed soldiers waited in disciplined formation. They maintained their patrols, cleaned their rifles, repaired bunkers, and raised the rising sun each dawn, as if war still burned around them. But slowly the silence grew heavier. By mid-1944, entire regiments across the Pacific had been cut off from Japan. No ships, no planes, no messages. American submarines prowled the sea lanes, sinking every vessel that dared to bring food or ammunition. On islands like Nauru, Kavieng, and Rabaul, Japanese troops faced a new kind of enemy: hunger. Rice rations dropped to a handful a day. Jungle roots became meals. Some resorted to eating insects, leaves, or the leather from their boots. Letters home were written but never sent. Radios hissed with static. Still, orders were obeyed. Japanese military doctrine demanded no surrender, no retreat, and no shame in death by starvation. Some units kept training, performing drills long after the Americans had vanished over the horizon. Others faded into the jungle, surviving in scattered groups, unaware the war was already moving hundreds of miles away. In time, these isolated outposts became ghost garrisons, forgotten fragments of an empire that no longer existed. When the war finally ended in 1945, some soldiers on bypassed islands didn't learn of Japan's surrender for months. A few refused to believe it for years. For them, the Pacific War never truly ended. It simply disappeared. While Japanese soldiers fought hunger in silence, two American commanders were shaping the Pacific War from opposite ends. In Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz ran his operations with quiet precision. He believed in calm analysis, calculated risk, and efficient destruction. His Central Pacific campaign was like a series of measured blows, each designed to break Japan's naval shield one ring at a time. Thousands of miles south, General Douglas MacArthur commanded his Southwest Pacific area from Brisbane, wrapped in charisma and theatrical resolve. To his staff, every operation was personal, especially the vow to return to the Philippines. Though their personalities clashed, their strategies intertwined. Nimitz pushed through the Central Pacific, the Gilberts, Marshalls, Marianas. MacArthur advanced through the southern flank, New Guinea, the Bismarcks, the Philippines. Together, their paths would close around Japan like the jaws of a trap, but their visions of war were different. MacArthur saw island hopping as liberation, reclaiming lands Japan had seized. Nimitz saw it as reduction, removing Japan's capacity to fight. In Washington, the Joint Chiefs balanced both men carefully, knowing that their rivalry produced results. While MacArthur's army leapt along the coasts and jungles, Nimitz's navy crossed open ocean, seizing key airfields that would become stepping stones toward Tokyo. To both, the key was selectivity. Not every island mattered. The ones that did became launch pads. The rest became irrelevant. And with each leap forward, Japan's once mighty ring of defenses unraveled a little more. The success of island hopping was not just about strategy. It was built on the back of an extraordinary technological transformation, the rise of true amphibious warfare. In 1941, the U.S. military had almost no experience with large-scale amphibious operations. By 1944, it had mastered them. New machines, tactics, and coordination, turned the Pacific into a proving ground for modern war. Amphibious tractors, LVTs or Amtraks, carried Marines across coral reefs that had doomed earlier assaults. Portable airstrips were built from crushed coral within days of a landing. Floating dry docks, supply ships, and mobile hospitals followed each invasion, creating entire cities on the water. Carrier aviation reached its peak. Fleets of Essex-class carriers, escorted by destroyers and supported by radar-controlled fighters, gave America control of the skies over every new target. Japan could no longer reinforce its outer islands or even evacuate the wounded. Meanwhile, the silent war beneath the waves intensified. U.S. submarines, once plagued by faulty torpedoes, now cut deep into Japan's supply arteries. Tankers and transports vanished beneath the sea, stranding garrisons across the Pacific. By late 1944, Japan's merchant fleet had been reduced to less than half its pre-war size. Without fuel, aircraft sat idle on their airstrips. Without supplies, soldiers waited in hunger. Without communication, even the proud fortress at Rabaul became nothing more than a memory of power. This technological mastery changed the meaning of distance. America could strike anywhere, anytime, and Japan could not keep up. These three angles, the starving garrisons, the dueling commanders, and the rise of amphibious warfare, converged into a single truth. Japan's empire was no longer a wall to climb, but a series of points to bypass. The strategy that had once seemed impossible was now the key to victory. But behind every tactical success lay human tragedy. Men left to fade on forgotten shores, and a nation still blind to the quiet collapse of its outer empire. As the Americans prepared for their next series of leaps, toward the Marianas, the Philippines, and beyond, Japan's high command clung to illusions of control. They still believed the next battle would be the decisive one. They didn't realize it had already been decided, not by combat but by starvation. Inside the walls of Tokyo's Imperial General Headquarters, the early months of 1944 brought a mixture of confidence and denial. Reports from the outer islands still arrived, short, proud, often optimistic. "Our men are ready," commanders declared from Truk, Rabaul, and the marshals. "The Americans cannot take us head-on." But as the months passed, the reports grew fewer. Then they stopped altogether. Communications across Japan's Pacific perimeter had begun to collapse. American submarines hunted every convoy. Allied codebreakers intercepted Japanese signals, turning secrecy into exposure. When radio silence fell, Tokyo often assumed it was discipline, not defeat. Japanese generals had built their defensive strategy on the idea of the decisive battle, a single climactic confrontation in which Japan's superior spirit would overcome America's superior machines. But island hopping destroyed that very premise. The Americans refused to give Japan the battle it wanted. Instead of attacking the fortress islands, they went around them. Instead of bleeding in frontal assaults, they let isolation do the killing. In this new kind of warfare, the Imperial Army's strength became its weakness. Each garrison, fortified, well-armed, loyal, became a self-contained prison. From Tokyo's perspective, it made no sense. Officers laughed at the thought that the Americans would leave thousands of enemy troops behind. "They will attack directly," one general said in early 1944. "It is unthinkable to do otherwise." But by the end of that year, unthinkable had become reality. The once proud bastions of Japan's outer defense, Rabaul, Truk, Wake, Nauru, were now silent. Their commanders still obeyed orders that no longer mattered. Their troops still saluted flags no one could see. It was not defeat in battle that broke Japan's empire. It was the slow collapse of connection, the fading heartbeat of an army abandoned by its own strategy. For the soldiers left behind, the war became a test not of combat but of endurance. The Japanese Army's code of Bushido taught that surrender was dishonor, and death in service was glory. When supplies ran out, many chose to die rather than yield. But starvation is not a sudden death. It's a quiet, drawn-out erosion of humanity. On bypassed islands across the Pacific, soldiers clung to routine. Some built shrines from driftwood and prayed to distant ancestors. Others recorded the date each morning in notebooks, unsure whether the empire still existed. On Wake Island, garrisons rationed food by the handful. On Rabaul, over 100,000 men waited under the constant roar of American bombers, surviving on jungle roots and the occasional fish caught from the bay. On Nauru, malaria spread faster than hope. To the Americans, these outposts were no longer threats, they were irrelevant. To the men inside them, they were the entire world. There are few records of those final months. Most diaries were destroyed. Many soldiers vanished without trace. When the war finally ended in August 1945, Allied forces discovered entire units still armed, still disciplined, waiting for orders that had never come. In some cases, those orders were found months, even years, later. A few soldiers, convinced the surrender was Allied propaganda, remained hidden into the 1950s. Their loyalty was absolute. Their suffering invisible. The moral tragedy of island hopping was not in its cruelty, it was in its silence. The Americans didn't need to kill those men. The sea, the jungle, and time did it for them. Island hopping was, at its heart, a masterpiece of strategic efficiency. A modern evolution of warfare that replaced brute force with selective precision. Traditional war demanded destruction of the enemy's entire force. Island hopping demanded only the destruction of their ability to matter. Every decision was rooted in mathematics and logistics. If an island could not threaten American shipping or air routes, it was bypassed. If it could, it was taken. Fast, hard, and with overwhelming power. It was a war of leverage, not conquest. Admiral Nimitz described it simply: hit them where they ain't. By focusing resources only on essential targets, the U.S. Navy advanced across the Pacific at a speed Japan could never match. The psychological effect was devastating. Japan's maps, once filled with confident red circles of control, now became hollow. Each bypassed fortress symbolized not a victory but a loss of relevance. And with every leap, the Americans shortened their supply lines while Japan's grew longer and emptier. Even before the first B-29 bomber took off from the Marianas to strike Tokyo, Japan's empire was already broken. Its soldiers still stood ready to fight, but their weapons rusted, their stomachs emptied, and their empire vanished around them. By 1944, the laughter of Japan's generals had turned into quiet disbelief. Their strongholds, beyond the pride of their defensive perimeter, had become graveyards in waiting. The Americans had rewritten the rules of war. Victory no longer required annihilation. It required isolation. And on each forgotten island, the men left behind became the silent witnesses to that new age of warfare. One where power was measured not by how much ground was taken, but by how much could be left behind. The Pacific sky glowed red over the Gilbert Islands in late 1943. From the decks of American carriers stretched across the horizon, squadrons of dauntless dive bombers and Avenger torpedo planes roared toward the coral specks of Tarawa and Macon. Below them, the ocean shimmered with the reflections of battleships firing broadsides, thunder rolling across the atolls. It was the first true test of island hopping, and it came at a brutal cost. At Tarawa, Marines waited ashore under murderous fire. Coral reefs trapped landing craft. Men drowned under the weight of their packs. In just 3 days, over 1,000 Americans lay dead. The Japanese garrison of 4,600 men was annihilated. Only 17 survived. Tarawa was a lesson written in blood, that even when bypassing the worst, some islands would demand everything. But from that moment on, the pattern was set. The Americans would strike hard, seize what mattered, and move forward before Japan could react. By January 1944, Nimitz's forces advanced into the Marshall Islands, skipping the heavily defended atolls of Maloelap, Wotia, and Jaluit. Instead, they landed directly at Kwajalein and Majuro, lightly held but strategically vital. Within a week, the U.S. had captured the Marshalls at a fraction of the expected cost. The Japanese garrisons left behind, cut off and confused, would never again receive supplies. Their commanders radioed Tokyo for reinforcements that would never come. Japan's defensive ring, once hailed as impenetrable, had been pierced in its center. As the U.S. Navy moved westward, it carried with it a new kind of momentum, not just military but psychological. The vast distances of the Pacific were shrinking, and every captured island brought Japan's homeland closer within reach. For the Japanese soldiers still clinging to their isolated outposts, the war was now a whisper. Then came the Mariana Islands, the decisive leap. June 1944. The U.S. fleet assembled in overwhelming strength, 15 aircraft carriers, 7 battleships, and over 500 escort vessels. Their target? Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the inner ring of Japan's empire. For the Japanese, the Marianas were sacred ground, the last shield before the home islands. From here, bombers could reach Tokyo itself. The battle for Saipan was unlike anything before. Japanese forces, nearly 30,000 strong, fought with suicidal determination. The Americans, under General Holland Smith and Admiral Raymond Spruance, pressed inland through dense jungle and fortified ridges. Every cave became a bunker, every hill a killing ground. When Saipan finally fell in July, Japan suffered not only a military defeat but a psychological one. The fall triggered the resignation of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and shattered the illusion of invincibility that had dominated Tokyo since 1941. Japan's emperor, Hirohito, was informed for the first time that the war might not be winnable. But while the battles raged on the beaches, the real destruction unfolded in the skies above. As the U.S. fleet moved into position, Japan launched nearly 400 aircraft in a desperate counterattack, what would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American radar, superior training, and new F-6F Hellcat fighters turned the battle into one of the most one-sided air engagements in history. Out of 400 Japanese planes, over 300 were destroyed. American losses, barely 30. The Imperial Navy's air arm, already crippled by attrition, was effectively destroyed. From that day forward, Japan would never again mount a major carrier offensive. The seas that once belonged to the rising sun now belonged entirely to the Stars and Stripes. The strategic implications were devastating. With the Marianas secured, the United States now possessed airfields within range of Japan. From Saipan and Tinian, the new B-29 superfortresses could launch bombing raids over Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka, burning into Japan's industrial heart. And behind this firepower stood a single quiet truth. Most of Japan's outer empire had already been bypassed and abandoned. Across the Pacific, from Truk Lagoon to Rabaul, from Nauru to Wake, tens of thousands of Japanese troops waited for an enemy that would never come. At Rabaul, once called the Gibraltar of the Pacific, more than 100,000 soldiers sat in tunnels and bunkers, surrounded by the jungle, bombed daily but never invaded. They were effectively prisoners of geography, cut off by sea, surrounded by silence. For Japan's generals, the concept was unthinkable. Their greatest fortress, now intact, fully armed, rendered meaningless. The Americans didn't need to take it. They simply erased it from the map of relevance. The Marianas Campaign marked the true turning of the tide, not only in geography but in mindset. The island-hopping strategy had matured into a weapon of precision and inevitability. From here, the road to the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa lay open. Japan's outer ring was gone, its navy broken, its air arm shattered, and its garrisons left to rot in silence. The laughter that once echoed through Tokyo's war rooms had long since vanished. What replaced it was something quieter: disbelief, fear, and the slow realization that the empire's proud outer defenses had become its tombs. The Pacific War was no longer about holding ground. It was about holding on to hope. By late 1944, the Pacific had become a vast trap. To the Japanese High Command, the map still glowed red with imperial holdings. The Carolines, the Marianas, the Philippines, the Solomons. But those red circles no longer meant control. They meant isolation. Every bypassed island was a wound that would never heal. The U.S. Navy now ruled the seas with absolute dominance. Japan's merchant fleet, once the lifeline of its empire, was nearly extinct. Submarines prowled the shipping lanes, torpedoes striking supply convoys that tried to reach cut-off garrisons. By 1944, Japan had lost over half of its transport ships. By 1945, more than 90%. Without ships, without fuel, the Japanese empire could not move, and immobility in war is death. At Truk Lagoon, once Japan's greatest naval base in the Central Pacific, the silence was absolute. Operation Hailstone in February 1944 had turned the lagoon into a graveyard. 60 warships and over 250 aircraft lay at the bottom, shattered by carrier-based raids. The Americans never landed there. They didn't need to. Truk had been neutralized, its garrison trapped, starving, forgotten. Thousands of Japanese sailors and soldiers lived out the rest of the war among the wreckage, surviving on coconuts, rats, and the hope of relief that would never come. A Japanese diary recovered after the war contained only 3 words written over and over in fading ink. No ships coming. Further south on Rabaul, the same story unfolded on a larger scale. Once the hub of Japan's South Pacific Command, Rabaul had been transformed into a fortress with miles of tunnels and gun positions. But after 1943, it was cut off completely. American bombers pounded it daily from the skies. Every air raid cratered the runways and shattered fuel depots, leaving aircraft grounded and pilots idle. By 1944, the garrison there numbered over 100,000, one of the largest concentrations of Japanese forces anywhere in the Pacific, yet they were utterly useless. General Hitoshi Imamura, the commander, refused to surrender or attempt breakout. He told his men to endure. But endurance meant hunger, disease, and slow death. Corpses were buried in shallow graves. The jungle reclaimed the fortifications. By the time Japan surrendered in 1945, most of Rabaul's garrison had not seen an enemy soldier in years. The once proud citadel of the empire had become an open-air prison. Meanwhile, America's advance rolled forward with terrifying efficiency. From the Marianas, the U.S. Army Air Forces began launching B-29 Superfortress raids directly on Japan's homeland. Massive bombers roared across 1,500 miles of open sea to unleash destruction on industrial cities that had once seemed untouchable. At the same time, General Douglas MacArthur made his long-promised return to the Philippines. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 sealed Japan's naval fate. The Imperial fleet, desperate to stop the invasion, sailed into a trap. In 4 days of brutal combat, Japan lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and over 400 aircraft. It was the largest naval battle in human history, and the last major action of Japan's navy. When the smoke cleared, Admiral Takeo Kurita's surviving ships limped back toward Japan, their decks burning. The sea, once their greatest weapon, now belonged entirely to the enemy. But perhaps the most haunting truth was this. While the Americans advanced westward, most of Japan's army, over 2 million men, remained stranded across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. On islands like Bougainville, New Britain, Palau, and Nauru, they still dug trenches, still hoisted flags, still waited for reinforcements that would never come. They grew thin and sick, eating roots and insects. Radios went silent. Ammunition ran out. Some commanders refused to believe they had been abandoned. In 1945, long after the U.S. had bypassed their islands, Japanese units were still drilling, still preparing for battles that would never happen. A captured officer later told Allied interrogators, "We could not understand it. The Americans simply went around us. They made us irrelevant." That single word, irrelevant, marked the death of Japan's grand strategy. By 1945, the empire's proud outer defenses, Rabaul, Truk, Wewak, Kavieng, Palau, all stood silent. No American flags flew over them, yet they were defeated just the same. The brilliance of island hopping was not in the number of battles fought, but in the number avoided. Each bypassed island became a symbol of Japan's strategic blindness, strongholds built for a kind of war that no longer existed. In Tokyo, the High Command still issued orders as if the empire stretched unbroken across the Pacific. But the maps lied. Behind every red dot on those charts was a starving garrison, a silent radio, a forgotten unit fading into the jungle. The laughter that had once greeted America's leapfrog idea in 1942 had long been replaced by dread. What began as a strategy mocked in Japanese war councils had become a slow, methodical dissection of the empire itself. The Pacific War was now in its endgame. The next step was the doorstep of Japan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and beyond them the homeland itself. But the story of island hopping was already complete. It had proven that in modern warfare, strength alone was meaningless without mobility, communication, and supply. And as the Americans prepared for their final bloody push toward Japan, thousands of Japanese soldiers on forgotten islands still stared out toward an empty sea, waiting for ships that would never come. The strategy that Japan once mocked had turned their empire into a chain of graves. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the Pacific looked nothing like the empire Japan had imagined in 1941. The red banners of conquest that once stretched across half the world were now fragments, islands of decay, isolated and broken. The power of island hopping had not been measured in the number of battles won, but in the lives not lost. It had saved America from the nightmare of invading every island. It had saved the Pacific from burning inch by inch, and it had starved Japan's war machine to death without needing to destroy it directly. At Rabaul, the largest Japanese garrison outside the homeland surrendered without firing a shot. Over 97,000 soldiers laid down their weapons to Australian and British forces in September 1945. Many were too weak to stand. They emerged from the jungle in rags, malnourished, sick, hollow-eyed. For nearly 2 years they had lived in complete isolation, no resupply, no medical aid. Some had not seen a newspaper since 1943. They had continued to build bunkers and man defenses long after the war had passed them by. Australian officers who accepted the surrender later wrote that it was like walking into a lost civilization. The same scenes played out across the Pacific, on Truk, Palau, New Britain, and Bougainville. Thousands of men who had once been the spearhead of an empire now stood in silence, waiting to be repatriated to a nation that no longer existed in the form they remembered. In Tokyo, the shock was equally profound. When news of the empire's collapse reached Japan's war ministry, officers who had once dismissed island hopping as childish or impossible realized that the strategy had outflanked not just their armies, but their entire philosophy of warfare. The Japanese military had been built on the idea of decisive battle, the belief that victory would come from one massive confrontation, one shattering blow. But island hopping had replaced that with a different kind of war, one of movement, logistics, and control of the sea. Instead of storming every fortress, America had rendered them irrelevant. Instead of fighting Japan's strength, it had attacked its lifelines. The result was catastrophic for Japan. Its outer defenses remained standing, guns still pointed at the sea, but no enemy ever came. Its armies, that millions strong, became prisoners of geography. American planners studied the results in awe. General George C. Marshall later described island hopping as a masterpiece of economy of force. It proved that in modern war, victory belonged to the side that controlled mobility and supply, not just courage and fortifications. Historians would later call it one of the most efficient campaigns in military history. Each leap forward shortened the war. Each bypassed island reduced the blood cost. By the time U.S. forces reached Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Japan's empire was already dead in all but name. But the cost had still been staggering. The Pacific had claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, American, Japanese, Australian, Filipino, and countless civilians caught in the crossfire. Every island won carried a weight that history still feels. When Allied occupation forces arrived on Japan's remote garrisons, they often found surreal scenes. Entire units still drilling, unaware the war had ended. Others had buried their dead with full ceremony, maintaining discipline until the last day. Some commanders burned their flags before surrendering, believing it was better to destroy the symbol than hand it over. On one bypassed island, a captured Japanese officer reportedly whispered to his interrogator, "We were ready to die defending this place." But no one ever came. That sentence carried the entire essence of Japan's failure. Their fortresses had been built for glory, but the war had passed them by. And in the end, it was not bombardment, invasion, or heroism that ended them. It was irrelevance. The Pacific was now quiet. The ocean that once echoed with the clash of fleets and the thunder of bombers was still again, littered with wrecks and ghosts. From the Marshalls to the Philippines, the tide had gone out, leaving behind the ruins of two empires, one broken, one triumphant. But for those who had fought, there was no triumph in the silence, only the memory of what it cost to reach it. And as Allied ships carried the last Japanese soldiers home from their abandoned islands, the world finally began to grasp the scale of what had happened. An empire that had once laughed at the idea of being bypassed had been undone, island, by a strategy it had never believed possible. The surrender ceremonies across the Pacific were both orderly and haunting. On small forgotten islands, Japanese officers appeared in immaculate uniforms, pressed, starched, buttons gleaming, even though their men were emaciated and barefoot. They lined up their units, saluted the empty horizon, and handed over swords polished for the last time. In many cases, the Americans and Australians receiving those surrenders were younger men, barely out of school, who looked upon these proud, broken soldiers with quiet respect. The war had not just destroyed Japan's empire, it had destroyed its illusions. When Allied intelligence finally compiled reports from the bypassed strongholds, the scale of Japan's isolation became clear. At Truk Lagoon, more than 20,000 troops had been stranded since early 1944. In Palau, Nearly 10,000 survived, surviving mostly on roots and fish. On New Ireland and New Britain, tens of thousands more waited in starvation. In total, over 300,000 Japanese soldiers across the Pacific had been rendered useless, trapped without supply or communication. Some units lost over 60% of their strength to hunger and disease alone. American analysts later calculated that the bypassing strategy had neutralized nearly a third of Japan's army without requiring direct combat. For the United States, the numbers told the story. The cost of island hopping, brutal as it was, had saved perhaps hundreds of thousands of additional casualties that a full island-by-island invasion would have demanded. Yet behind those numbers were human stories of unimaginable endurance. On bypassed islands, diaries told of soldiers boiling palm bark into soup, of units cutting their ammunition in half to extend training exercises, of doctors performing surgeries without anesthesia. One diary from a Japanese medic on New Britain read, "We no longer fight the Americans. We fight hunger. Every sunrise is another victory." For many, surrender was not shame, it was relief. They had fought a war that had forgotten them, for an empire that could no longer reach them. When news of Japan's formal surrender reached these remote garrisons in August 1945, some soldiers refused to believe it. They thought it was Allied propaganda. Others wept silently, relieved that the long waiting was over. It would take months, even years, to locate and repatriate all isolated Japanese soldiers scattered across the Pacific. Some would not emerge until the 1950s, still loyal to orders that had long since ceased to exist. For historians, island hopping became more than a military strategy. It was a study in adaptation. It proved that war was evolving. Where Japan had built fortresses and clung to fixed positions, America had built fleets and learned to move. The success of island hopping lay in its integration, the perfect coordination of sea, air, and land. It demonstrated that control of the ocean could determine the fate of armies thousands of miles away. The campaign also marked a shift in global power. The United States emerged from the Pacific War not only victorious, but transformed into a maritime superpower, a nation that had mastered the art of projection, logistics, and total coordination. Japan, on the other hand, entered the post-war years with a hard-earned understanding of humility. The empire that had once expanded in arrogance now rebuilt itself in discipline. Many of its surviving officers in post-war interviews admitted that their failure to grasp the importance of logistics and air-sea coordination had doomed them long before Hiroshima or Nagasaki. One former Imperial Navy officer summarized it simply, "We prepared for a war of swords in an age of machines." For the Pacific itself, the scars remained. The lagoons of Truk and the jungles of Rabaul became tombs of steel, silent witnesses to the war's cruelty and futility. Coral reefs glittered with the bones of ships and men. Villages across Micronesia, the Solomons and New Guinea still bore the echoes of battles fought nearby but never forgotten. And yet, among the ruins, a strange peace settled. The same islands that once symbolized death and isolation became symbols of endurance and recovery. By 1946, as Allied war crime trials began and the last prisoners were returned home, the lessons of island hopping were already shaping future military doctrine. The U.S. Navy studied it as the blueprint for modern amphibious warfare. Future conflicts, from Korea to Vietnam to the Persian Gulf, would all carry echoes of its logic. Strike where it matters, move where the enemy cannot follow, and never waste strength on the irrelevant. For Japan, the strategy it once mocked became a symbol of its greatest humiliation, and paradoxically, the foundation for its rebirth. The same discipline that built fortresses in the jungle would now build factories, cities, and industries that would rise from the ashes within a generation. By the time the last repatriation ship sailed home in 1946, the Pacific had returned to silence. The laughter that had once greeted the impossible American idea of bypassing islands had vanished long ago, buried beneath jungles and coral reefs. The empire that had once sought to dominate the Pacific had been outthought, outmaneuvered, and finally outlasted. Its proud soldiers, left to starve on forgotten shores, had paid the ultimate price for the arrogance of their generals. In the end, the war in the Pacific was not won by the largest army or the boldest generals. It was won by a principle, the ability to see beyond the battlefield. Island hopping was not a strategy of destruction. It was a strategy of understanding, of knowing that victory did not lie in taking every stronghold, but in making the enemy's strength meaningless. Each bypassed island became a monument to a shift in thinking. Where Japan clung to the idea of honor through defense, America redefined victory through motion, adaptability, and endurance. The silent jungles of Rabaul, the flooded bunkers of Truk, and the skeletal remains of airfields on Palau still whisper the same truth. That in modern war, to be cut off is to cease to exist. For the Japanese soldiers who survived the Forgotten Islands, the end came not with gunfire but with silence. The long, echoing silence of a world that had moved on without them. They had fought bravely, endured unspeakable hardship, and obeyed their orders until starvation took the last of their strength. But their courage could not overcome the fatal flaw of their leader's pride. And for the Americans who advanced across the Pacific, the lesson was equally profound. They had learned that the shortest road to victory was not through confrontation, but through control. Of the seas, of the skies, and of time itself. Today, the wrecks of ships still rest beneath the clear waters of the Pacific, rusting quietly beneath coral and sunlight. The war is gone, but its logic remains, a reminder that strategy can outlast steel, and that arrogance, no matter how fortified, will eventually collapse under the weight of reality. The Japanese generals who once laughed at the idea of bypassing islands could never have imagined that laughter would one day echo only through abandoned bunkers and empty maps. Their empire did not fall in fire. It fell in silence, starved, surrounded, and forgotten by the very sea it once sought to command.